On a gray October morning in 2018, 43-year-old commercial fisherman Michael Hawkins set out from Newport, Oregon, for what should have been a routine 3-day fishing trip. His 42-foot vessel, the Mariner's Hope, was spotted leaving the harbor at 5:17 a.m., according to harbor surveillance footage. The weather forecast predicted mild conditions. Hawkins had filed a float plan, fueled his boat, and checked in with the harbor master. Everything seemed normal. 3 days later, no one had heard from him. The Coast Guard received a distress call at 6:53 p.m. reporting the Mariner's Hope missing. What followed was the largest search operation along the Oregon coast that year. 7 years later, in November 2025, a fishing trawler reported a partially submerged vessel 76 miles northwest of the Oregon coast. When rescue crews arrived, they found the badly weathered Mariner's Hope. The most disturbing finding wasn't the boat itself, but what was discovered inside a sealed compartment beneath the main cabin floor. Human remains that dental records would later confirm belonged to Michael Hawkins. But according to the medical examiner, these weren't remains that had been adrift at sea for 7 years. The evidence suggested Hawkins had been alive, at least until recently. Marks on the bones indicated someone had survived in that compartment for an extended period. When investigators asked how this was possible, the forensic pathologist's answer was simple. Someone was keeping him there. The Coast Guard's initial search in 2018 covered over 2,800 square nautical miles. No debris field was found, no emergency locator beacon was activated, and no body was recovered. The case of Michael Hawkins became another tragic story of a fisherman lost at sea, until that November day in 2025 when everything changed. The boat that was recovered wasn't simply adrift. It showed signs of having been deliberately anchored in an offshore location, modified, and regularly maintained. The question wasn't just what happened to Michael Hawkins, but who had been controlling his vessel for the past 7 years, and why they had kept him prisoner inside his own boat. Michael Hawkins had been a commercial fisherman for over 20 years. A divorced father of 2 adult children, he operated independently, making a modest but stable living from the sea. On October 14, 2018, he purchased fuel at Newport Harbor at 4:36 a.m., according to credit card records. The harbor security camera captured his vessel leaving at 5:17 a.m. His float plan indicated he would be fishing approximately 45 miles offshore, targeting albacore tuna, and would return on October 17th. At 5:42 a.m., he made his last radio check with the harbor, reporting clear conditions and good visibility. When the Mariner's Hope failed to return on October 17th, Hawkins' daughter, Emma, contacted the harbor master. No distress signals had been received, and attempts to contact the vessel via radio were unsuccessful. At 6:53 p.m., the Coast Guard was officially notified, and a search and rescue operation was initiated. Coast Guard records indicate the first aircraft was dispatched at 7:22 p.m., with 2 vessels following at 7:45 p.m. Weather conditions had deteriorated since Hawkins's departure, with 15-foot swells and winds of 25 knots, but nothing that would typically overwhelm an experienced captain with a seaworthy vessel. The search operation expanded over the next 3 days. 3 Coast Guard cutters, 2 helicopters, and multiple volunteer vessels covered the expected route and surrounding areas. On October 20th, a life jacket believed to belong to the Mariner's Hope was recovered 38 miles offshore. No other debris was found. On October 21st, with no further evidence and diminishing probability of survival, the active search was suspended. The official report listed Michael Hawkins as lost at sea, presumed deceased. The case remained inactive until November 12, 2025, when the commercial fishing vessel, Pacific Venture, reported a partially submerged boat approximately 76 miles off the Oregon coast. The vessel was not in shipping lanes and was anchored in an unusual location known for rough seas and poor fishing. The Coast Guard dispatched a cutter to investigate. Upon arrival, they identified the vessel as the Mariner's Hope, registered to Michael Hawkins. The boat was secured and towed to Newport for examination. The initial inspection of the Mariner's Hope, disappearances, revealed several anomalies. The vessel had been modified with additional fuel tanks, extending its range significantly beyond its original capacity. Solar panels had been installed on the roof of the cabin, providing limited but consistent power. The navigation equipment had been altered, with the GPS tracker disabled, but the mechanical systems maintained in working condition. Most notably, the main cabin had been reconfigured, with a hidden compartment constructed beneath the floor, accessible only from a hatch that could be secured from the outside. When investigators opened this compartment, they discovered human remains. The space measured approximately 6 feet by 4 feet, with a height of just over 3 feet. According to the forensic team's initial assessment, the compartment contained evidence of long-term habitation, water containers, food wrappers with recent expiration dates, waste buckets, and makeshift bedding. The human remains were partially mummified due to the salt air but showed no signs of immersion in seawater. The compartment had been sealed against water intrusion, creating what investigators described as a prison cell within the vessel. Oregon State Police Detective Maria Suarez was assigned as lead investigator. With 15 years of experience in major crimes and 3 years specializing in cold cases, she approached the scene methodically. "Our first priority was establishing the identity of the remains," she stated in her report. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Michael Hawkins. However, the condition of the remains presented a significant puzzle. According to the medical examiner's preliminary findings, decomposition patterns were inconsistent with a death occurring 7 years prior. Dr. Eleanor Reed, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examination, estimated that death had occurred within the past 6 to 12 months. "The remains show evidence of prolonged malnutrition," Dr. Reed noted in her report. "There are healing fractures on both tibias and the left radius that occurred at different times, suggesting multiple traumatic events over years, not months. Most significantly, the fingertips show patterns of wear consistent with repeated attempts to escape the confined space. Laboratory analysis of the food wrappers found in the compartment confirmed manufacturing dates as recent as 8 months prior to discovery. The evidence clearly indicated that someone had been maintaining the vessel and, presumably, keeping Hawkins alive in captivity. The investigation's focus shifted to determining who had controlled the Mariner's Hope during the 7 years it was missing. The vessel's exterior showed signs of regular maintenance: fresh anti-fouling paint on the hull, relatively new mooring lines, and engine components that had been replaced within the past 2 years. "Someone was keeping this boat operational," Detective Suarez noted, "and they were keeping it deliberately isolated." Forensic teams collected trace evidence from throughout the vessel. Hair, fibers, and partial fingerprints were recovered from the pilot house and main cabin. DNA testing revealed the presence of at least 2 individuals besides Hawkins. One DNA profile was eventually identified as belonging to Carl Mitchum, a 58-year-old unlicensed boat mechanic with a history of marine-related thefts along the Pacific coast. The second profile remained unidentified. Investigators examined the modified electrical system on the vessel. The solar panels connected to a series of deep-cycle marine batteries, providing power to minimal systems, internal lighting, a small refrigerator, and what appeared to be a crude monitoring system focused on the hidden compartment. A logbook was recovered from a waterproof container in the pilot house. Entries, while sporadic, spanned from December 2018 to September 2025. The handwriting analysis identified it as belonging to Mitchum. The logbook provided the first glimpse into what had happened to Michael Hawkins. Entries were often cryptic, but they established a pattern of someone visiting the vessel approximately every 10-14 days. Notations about supply runs and maintenance checks were common. More disturbing were entries referencing the passenger and feeding day. One entry from March 20,000, Yuan in Jack in 2022 read, "Passenger becoming difficult again. Reduced rations until compliance improves. Still needs to understand the rules." While examining the vessel's communication equipment, investigators discovered a modified marine radio. The standard VHF radio had been disabled, but a long-range single sideband radio remained operational, though altered to transmit only on specific frequencies not monitored by Coast Guard or commercial traffic. This suggested a means of private communication between the vessel and someone on shore. Detective Suarez focused her investigation on Carl Mitchum. Records showed he had worked periodically at various marinas along the Oregon and Washington coasts, but never maintained steady employment. He had prior convictions for boat theft, fencing stolen marine equipment, and assault. His last known address was a small apartment in Astoria, Oregon, but neighbors reported not having seen him for several months. Credit card records and marina security footage provided crucial evidence. Mitchum's card had been used to purchase fuel, provisions, and marine supplies in Newport, Astoria, and Westport, Washington, on a regular schedule that aligned with the supply runs mentioned in the logbook. Security cameras at a Newport marine supply store captured images of Mitchum purchasing large quantities of canned food, water purification tablets, and boat maintenance supplies on multiple occasions between 2019 and 2025. On December 3, 2025, investigators executed a search warrant on Mitchum's apartment in Astoria. The unit appeared abandoned, but contained valuable evidence. Charts of offshore locations, with notations for anchoring, maintenance schedules for the Mariner's Hope, and a collection of Michael Hawkins' personal effects, including his wallet, cell phone, and family photographs. A notebook found in a kitchen drawer contained what appeared to be calculations of tidal patterns, weather windows, and supply requirements. The most significant finding was a series of photographs showing the Mariner's Hope, at various stages of modification. These images confirmed that the hidden compartment had been constructed deliberately as a confinement space. One photo showed Hawkins, visibly injured and restrained, inside the compartment during its construction. The date stamp indicated the photo was taken in November 2018, approximately 1 month after Hawkins' disappearance. By mid-December, investigators had established a timeline of events, but still lacked a clear motive or understanding of why Mitchum had kept Hawkins captive for 7 years. They also needed to locate Mitchum, who remained at large. The break came on December 18th, when a commercial crabbing vessel reported finding an inflatable dinghy adrift approximately 40 miles offshore. Inside was the body of a man later identified as Carl Mitchum. The autopsy determined he had died from exposure and dehydration, likely after his dinghy's outboard motor failed. Based on decomposition, his death had occurred in early October 2025, aligning with the estimated time the Mariner's Hope had been abandoned. With Mitchum deceased, investigators turned to reconstructing the events of October 2018 through forensic evidence and the recovered documents. The picture that emerged was disturbing. According to Detective Suarez's case summary, the evidence suggests that Mitchum intercepted Hawkins' vessel on or about October 15, 2018, approximately 45 miles offshore. The attack was premeditated and specifically targeted Hawkins, not a random act of piracy. Forensic examination of the pilot house revealed blood spatter consistent with a violent assault. DNA confirmed it belonged to Hawkins. Tool marks on the cabin door indicated Mitchum had likely ambushed Hawkins when he came below deck, striking him with a heavy object. Hawkins had been subdued, but not killed. Instead, Mitchum had imprisoned him in the modified compartment while he repurposed the vessel. The recovered documents and logbook entries suggested Mitchum had been living partially on the vessel and partially on shore, making regular trips to maintain both the boat and his captive. The vessel was kept anchored in a remote location, moved periodically to avoid detection. The modifications to the fuel system and the addition of solar panels indicated Mitchum had planned for long-term isolation. As the investigation progressed, the question of motive became central. Detective Suarez interviewed former associates of both men. A breakthrough came when investigators spoke with James Riley, a boat mechanic who had worked with both Hawkins and Mitchum years earlier. According to Riley's statement, Carl always had this thing about Mike. They worked together on a commercial boat about 15 years ago. Mike reported Carl for stealing equipment, and Carl lost his license. He blamed Mike for ruining his career. He talked about it for years, how Mike had it coming. This account aligned with employment records showing both men had worked aboard the commercial fishing vessel Pacific Lady in 2003-2004. Incident reports confirmed Hawkins had reported theft of equipment, leading to Mitchum's termination and subsequent criminal charges. Mitchum had served 14 months in prison and had his commercial fishing credentials permanently revoked. In the years that followed, he had struggled to maintain employment, working cash jobs at various marinas, while Hawkins had established his independent operation. The personal documents found in Mitchum's apartment included journal entries dating back to 2010, revealing a long-standing obsession with Hawkins. One entry read, "Saw Hawkins' boat today. He doesn't deserve it. Everything he has should have been mine." Another from 2017 stated, "The plan is coming together. Taking his boat isn't enough. He needs to know what it's like to lose everything, slowly, day by day." These writings revealed Mitchum's intention wasn't simply to steal the mariner's hope or to kill Hawkins in revenge. His plan was more calculated: to imprison Hawkins aboard his own vessel, forcing him to exist in a state of perpetual captivity while Mitchum controlled his former life. The logbook entries suggested Mitchum regularly taunted Hawkins with news of the outside world, telling him how he had been declared dead, how his family had moved on, and how the boat that had been his livelihood was now Mitchum's property. Forensic evidence from the hidden compartment corroborated this psychological torture. Scratched into the wooden wall were calendar markings, allowing Hawkins to track days and months. These markings extended for years, with the final entries dating to approximately September 2025, aligning with Mitchum's estimated time of death. The compartment contained a small porthole, positioned so that Hawkins could see outside but not be seen, forcing him to witness Mitchum operating his vessel. The medical examination of Hawkins' remains told the final chapter of his ordeal. According to Dr. Reed's analysis, Hawkins had survived in the compartment for nearly 7 years under conditions of extreme deprivation. Evidence of healed fractures indicated periodic physical abuse. Malnutrition was severe, but managed just enough to keep him alive. The cause of death was ultimately determined to be dehydration, occurring after Mitchum's own death left Hawkins trapped without access to water. The evidence suggests that when Mitchum died in early October, Hawkins was left in the locked compartment with limited supplies, Dr. Reed stated. Based on the condition of the remains and the surrounding evidence, he likely survived for approximately 7 to 10 days after being abandoned. Scratch marks around the hatch showed Hawkins had made desperate attempts to escape, but the locking mechanism had been designed to secure from the outside only. The case file notes that the vessel had been anchored in an area rarely traversed by other boats, explaining why it remained undiscovered for nearly 2 months after both men had died. Seasonal storm patterns eventually caused the anchor line to fail, allowing the vessel to drift until it was spotted by the Pacific Venture in November. On January 15, 2026, Detective Suarez officially closed the investigation. With Mitchum deceased and no evidence suggesting accomplices, there would be no criminal proceedings. The Mariner's Hope was released to Hawkins' family. His daughter Emma requested it be scuttled at sea after personal items were removed. In a brief statement, she said, "We mourned my father 7 years ago, believing he had died doing what he loved. Learning he suffered for so long, so close yet unreachable, is a wound that will never heal." The forensic examination produced one final, haunting detail. Among the scratches and markings on the compartment walls was a message Hawkins had apparently carved during his final days: "I am still here." According to the forensic analyst's report, the carving showed signs of having been repeatedly traced over years, deepening with each pass, as if Hawkins was reinforcing his own existence, in the face of his captor's efforts to erase it. The case of Michael Hawkins remains one of the most disturbing maritime crimes documented along the Pacific coast. It reveals how isolation at sea can be exploited for the most calculated acts of cruelty. The modified vessel, which had been Hawkins' livelihood, became both his prison and his grave. The ocean, which had been his workplace for decades, became the barrier that kept him isolated from any possibility of rescue. In the aftermath, the Coast Guard implemented new protocols for tracking vessels and identifying suspicious modifications to commercial fishing boats. Harbor personnel received additional training on recognizing signs of vessel theft and unauthorized modifications. But as Detective Suarez noted in her final report, this case represents a premeditated act of revenge, planned over more than a decade. No regulatory system could have anticipated or prevented the specific circumstances that led to Hawkins' captivity. The marine community in Newport held a memorial service where Hawkins's ashes were scattered at sea. His fellow fishermen established a scholarship fund for maritime safety training. The Mariner's Hope was documented thoroughly before being scuttled at the family's request. The vessel that had been both Hawkins' pride and prison committed to the depths. The medical examiner's final report included this observation: "The physical evidence tells us Hawkins survived approximately 2,520 days in captivity, in a space barely large enough to lie down. The psychological resilience this required is remarkable, as is the physical endurance. That he continued to mark the passage of days until the very end suggests he never surrendered hope of eventual rescue." The report concludes with a clinical assessment of his final days. Terminal dehydration would have caused increasing confusion, followed by organ failure. The physical evidence suggests he remained conscious and aware of his situation until approximately 448 hours before death. Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Jessica Walsh, who led the recovery of the vessel, noted in her statement, "In my 17 years of service, I've never encountered a case like this. The ocean normally returns what it takes eventually, but in this case, it kept him hidden in plain sight, floating on the same waters we searched 7 years ago." The investigation ultimately couldn't determine exactly why Mitchum had chosen such an elaborate form of revenge rather than simply killing Hawkins. Psychological profilers consulted on the case suggested the prolonged captivity represented a distorted sense of justice in Mitchum's mind, making Hawkins experience what Mitchum perceived as his own imprisonment within a damaged life after losing his career. The calculations and planning documented in Mitchum's notes revealed a methodical mind focused entirely on this single act of revenge for over a decade. What remains less clear is how Mitchum managed to intercept Hawkins at sea without raising suspicion. The working theory, based on marine fuel purchases and witness statements, suggests he had been tracking Hawkins' routine for months, learning his preferred fishing grounds and patterns. He likely approached the Mariner's Hope in the guise of a disabled vessel needing assistance, a request no experienced fisherman would ignore. This would explain why Hawkins had not sent a distress signal. He would have had no reason to be alarmed until Mitchum was already aboard. The case has been documented in Coast Guard training materials as an example of how maritime crimes can exploit the isolation and vast spaces of the ocean. It also highlights how the assumption that missing vessels have sunk can lead investigations away from considering other possibilities. As the official report notes, the presumption of accidental sinking precluded consideration of scenarios involving deliberate concealment of the vessel. For the fishing community of Newport, the case has left lasting effects. Harbor security has been enhanced, and fishermen report a heightened awareness of potential dangers, not just from the sea itself, but from those who might exploit its isolation. "We always watch the weather and the water," said Thomas Lang, a longtime fisherman who knew Hawkins. "Now we watch each other's backs more carefully, too." The technical aspects of the Mariner's Hope modifications have been studied by maritime security experts. The solar power system, while crude, provided sufficient energy to maintain minimal systems and was virtually undetectable from a distance. The anchoring system Mitchum devised allowed the vessel to remain in areas where commercial boats rarely traveled, effectively hiding in open water. These elements demonstrate how traditional search patterns based on expected drift from a vessel's last known position can be rendered ineffective when a vessel is deliberately anchored outside normal transit routes. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was the planning documented in Mitchum's journals. Entries dating back to 2015 showed he had been developing his plan for years, studying Hawkins' routines, researching boat modifications, and calculating exactly how to maintain both a vessel and a captive at sea long term. The detail and patience revealed in these notes suggested an obsession that had consumed Mitchum's life, ultimately leading to his own death when the weather conditions he had navigated successfully for years finally turned against him. Emma Hawkins, in her only interview following the conclusion of the investigation, reflected on the paradox of her father's fate. "For 7 years, we thought he died doing what he loved. Instead, he was trapped inside the very thing that represented his freedom." She established a foundation focused on maritime safety and communication systems for small commercial vessels, hoping to prevent similar tragedies. The final entry in the case file notes that all physical evidence has been archived, the vessel has been laid to rest, and both Hawkins and Mitchum have been interred or memorialized according to their families' wishes. The ocean that separated them from society has reclaimed the scene of the crime. What remains is the documentation of how isolation and obsession converged to create a living nightmare that lasted 7 years, hidden in open water, just beyond the horizon.